The shale lip crumbled under Lyra's claws, a hiss of gravel and a flash of scarlet fur against the abyss, and I didn't think so much as lunge, seizing her tail with both hands and hauling backward until my shoulders burned and my boots carved trenches in the dust. The weight of her life yanking fire through my arms while the squad froze in one shared heartbeat of shock. Because every human and every off-worlder on this march knew the law like a prayer scratched into bone. Never touch a vulpine's tail. Never unless you had a death wish or a vow to offer. And yet my fingers had already closed on the forbidden plume before memory could catch up, before fear could open its mouth, before breath returned to 12 throats at once, and the wind carried our silence down the canyon like a secret it couldn't keep. Mountain air scraped my lungs raw as we moved again through the broken ranges, a column of 12 cutting across slag stone and bomb glass veins where lightning had once married the ground, our boots rasping a rhythm that sounded too much like a countdown. And I, Cale Draven, counted rations and steps and the number of days since warm food, as if arithmetic could sweeten the ache in my joints, while the old plates on my soles peeled like tired scabs and the straps of my pack argued with my collarbones. And at our point walked a Lyra of house fur, lone vulpine among us, her crimson tail swaying with a metronome's certainty, bright against the gray like a warning flare we were all too superstitious to smother. We were a mismatched blade hammered from what the war hadn't yet spent, human scouts and alien specialists stitched together by necessity, and the sort of orders you aren't meant to outlive, with Sergeant Rusk setting the pace in his gravel-tempered growl and doing the holy work of cursing command, while the rear guard sagged and pretended not to hear, and beside me trudged Jax Marin with a grin that could survive an airstrike, betting 5 credits the sergeant's heart would quit before the enemy's guns, a bet I wouldn't take because Rusk was the kind of iron that doesn't know how to rust, and behind us the heavy gunners, Cade and Orin, carried rifles that looked like mistakes until they spoke in thunder and made the canyon flinch. Lyra moved as if the terrain had signed a treaty with her bones, every step precise, every pause a thesis on patience, red hair bound in a soldier's knot with a few rebellious strands drawing parentheses around her sharp profile, white-tipped ears flicking to catch whispers the human ear couldn't court, and that tail, long, lustrous, criminally alive, swept a measured arc with each stride, a pendulum that kept time with a culture I didn't yet understand. So we gave her space like you give a live mine or a sleeping cat god, not from cruelty and not from fear alone, but because ritual is a kind of armor and none of us wanted to be the one to test its seams in the wrong direction. We halted at a ridge where the wind spoke in stones, and the squad collapsed in the language of sore knees and rattling canteens, helmets off, faces gray under a dust that never quits, while Lyra stood apart like punctuation at the end of another sentence, leaning against a knife of rock with her tail curled around one leg as if it were an oath at ease, splitting a ration bar with a neat snap of claw and chewing in a silence so complete it made ours sound noisy, and Jax elbowed me with the devil's idea that I should try kindness on the fox. So I went because stubbornness is my only talent worth much, and asked if she preferred the quiet or merely preferred us at a distance, and she said the quiet preferred her, and that was almost humor, which I took as a victory I didn't deserve. Back on the march, I measured her from the corner of my eye the way you measure weather, not for gossip, but for survival, because she never sweated, never sagged, never trembled even in the tail that seemed to breathe on its own, and if the rest of us were meat and fatigue, she was alloy and intention, and when Rusk's fist came up and we melted into the rocks, nothing stirred but the wind until the drones came low and mean. 3 needles with red eyes that sang in a pitch your teeth could taste. And we scattered into firing lines that weren't pretty but worked, my rounds sparking off hard carapace, while Cade barked thunder that turned one machine into a tumbling cinder. And then Lyra moved like a verdict, leaping angles that made math blush, landing shots into seams the drone designers must have sworn didn't exist. The last drone tried altitude and arrogance, strafing plasma across our poor excuses for cover. And she climbed. Gods, she climbed, like the cliff had dim memories of raising her, bounding ledge to ledge with the tail a comet red behind her. 2 shots, then a third to the sensor core, and the sky glittered with machine shrapnel while the ground remembered to breathe. And when she dropped back to our level, there was no smile, no preen, just the quiet of a task completed, the same as she might clean a blade or sip a canteen. And Jax muttered about never playing cards against her reflexes while I tried not to stare the way people stare at fires from a safe distance, telling themselves they're warm and not thinking the word worship. We bivouacked where the canyon kinked into a shallow pocket, lantern light painting our faces into a troop of tired masks. Cade and Orin arguing with their rifle housings in the affectionate way gunners do. Rusk sketching a perimeter with a voice that cut, and Jax dealing cards from a deck so soft with use it felt like cloth, but my attention drifted where it shouldn't, to the periphery where Illyra sharpened a blade with a whispering stroke that found a rhythm close to a heartbeat, and I went to her again because persistence is a form of prayer, offering company as if it were a small gift you can afford to give in a war, and she told me it wasn't company she lacked but quiet, and I said we bled together, which makes a kind of family in some languages. And she said I didn't understand, which was true. So I asked to be taught, and she flicked that tail once, a slow punctuation, and said no. Morning came hard and steel gray, the pass narrowing to knife edges that didn't like our boots, and we filed single along ledges that felt like thoughts you don't say out loud. Pebbles skipping into mist that never reached bottom, Rusk's orders tightening into clipped syllables, and I counted breaths again, counted the beats between footsteps. Counted how often Illyra's tail brushed rock. Nothing more than a brush, but each contact deliberate like a fuse deciding not to burn, and the ambush arrived the way thunder arrives after you've been warning yourself it won't. Thin insectoid silhouettes unscrolling over the ridgeline with rifles that spat heat and contempt. And we dove into cover that lied about being cover, while Cade and Orin taught the ridges a new geometry, and Illyra wove into their lines with rifle and claw. Efficient as weather, brutal as truth. I kept her flank because it felt like the only math that mattered. And when an insectid vaulted to take her spine, I put a beam through its core before my brain could offer a wise counsel. And she glanced, the barest incline of chin, a nod sharpened to a single molecule, not gratitude exactly but acknowledgement, battlefield grammar we both knew. And the fight stretched thin until it snapped, leaving us panting and counting ammunition like counting sins, and that night in the shallow cave where the lanterns gave us yellow halos we hadn't earned, Jax tried to explain tail law with the seriousness he usually reserved for card games, saying the tail was heart and lineage wrapped in living silk, a bond deeper than vows, that touching it without sanction was either a death sentence or a binding, nothing easier, nothing in between. I told him culture couldn't possibly be that literal, and he told me law is often literal when it hurts most. And Cade swore he'd seen a vulpine tear a man apart for a brush of fur in a crowded checkpoint, so maybe superstition had teeth, and I stared across at Illyra again, at the deliberate way the tail moved even at rest, slow and exact like a deliberate breath. And I promised myself I would never test that law because there are lines you can respect even without believing in them, and the fire cracked. And the cave turned our silhouettes into cave paintings waiting for some future child to misunderstand, and her blade whispered against stone in a rhythm that anchored the night while my eyes stayed open longer than duty required. By noon the next day the pass tightened to a thread, and we walked it like sinners on a beam, Rusk's voice saying keep it tight, while my rifle balanced across my chest, and my nerves hummed the way power lines hum on cold mornings, and Illyra went a step ahead of me. The tail a red horizon I refused to think of as proximity, because this was about footing and breath and not about the way my pulse stuttered when the fur brushed air near my thigh. And the enemy chose that moment to write their name. In our day, bolts arcing down to spall the stone into shrapnel that bit skin and confidence. And we returned fire at angles that barely existed, Cade tearing chunks from the cliff, while Orin stitched suppressive lines that wrote our intentions across the ridge. Illyra darted up to steal height from fate, tail flaring like a banner that dared the wind to contradict it, and an energy bolt slapped the ledge ahead of her into powder, the edge giving way under boots that always before seemed too sure to fail, and in that breath length in which the world doesn't quite believe itself, she hung, claws raking stone that answered with sand, tail a brilliant arc over the void as gravity opened its old mouth, and I was already moving, already dropping the rifle, to let it clatter like a lesser concern, already lunging into a grip I had sworn gods and Jax, and my better judgment I would never take, hands closing on living silk that was warmer than fear, heavier than anything so beautiful has a right to be. The yank tore my shoulder like a bad promise, but I braced, boots skidding, back finding a stubborn angle against the rock, the ache in every tendon turning into a song about persistence while she scrabbled for purchase. And together we found enough physics to steal her back from the drop, spilling in an untidy heap that smelled of dust and hot air and whatever vulpine fur keeps for itself, and in the roar of battle reduced to a hush around us. She stared, eyes wide and bright as coin in a well, my hand still full of her most guarded secret. Both of us stunned by the truth that instinct had beaten law to the draw and put us in the crosshairs of meaning neither of us had asked for. I let go like it burned, hands emptying as if guilt were a weight you could drop, telling her she was safe in a voice that sounded borrowed, and she didn't answer, only pressed claws to stone until the world remembered to move, then rose with a motion too smooth to be called panic, rifle back to shoulder with that same terrifying grace, and I snatched my weapon from the ground to fight alongside her, pretending the sting in my palms was only from rock and not from silk, pretending the tremor in my gut was adrenaline alone and not the first shiver of a bond one didn't yet have language to refuse. When the ridge fell quiet except for the metallic echo of what had tried and failed to kill us, Rusk counted bodies and ammo and sins and told us to drink water like the order might keep us from dying later, and I sat with my chest working like a bellows in need of oil, while Elira stood nearby with her tail drawn tight to her leg, not swaying now but guarded, wrapped like a banner furled for bad weather. Her gaze on distance, but with an angle to it that felt like a question held between molars. And Jax crouched beside me with a grin gone thin and said I was a magnificent idiot because instinct is noble until it isn't, because I had touched what we all swore not to touch, and that meant something that did not much care what I had intended. I swallowed explanations that wouldn't matter, the squad's side-eye, passing over me like weather you dress for and hope to outlast, Cade muttering that he didn't want to be present when the fox collected whatever debt I'd written, Orin raising his brows like a man watching a card trick he didn't volunteer for, and Rusk either missed the exchange or chose Command's favorite mercy of looking the other way. But the loudest thing in the formation was the quiet between Elira and me, a hush that wasn't emptiness so much as pressure, the kind of silence that makes you watch the horizon for lightning you know is there even before you see the cloud. We pushed deeper into the ranges, each of us burdened by old fatigue and the new weight of a law I'd bent until it snapped, boots biting gravel that answered with small betrayals. The war reduced to the geometry of ledges and the arithmetic of ammunition, and Elira didn't speak to me or to anyone, her posture tighter than I'd ever seen it. The tail kept close as if it needed her protection from me, and yet sometimes I felt her glance like a touch between shoulder blades, not anger, not even accusation, but a calculus I couldn't enter, and at a brief rest by a grudging trickle of water, even Jack stopped joking long enough to whisper that I'd changed the shape of our days without meaning to, that I needed to understand what the change could cost if I wanted it not to collect from the wrong account. Evening found us in a shallow alcove that pretended to be a camp, lanterns sighing against the dark while stew steamed like a rumor of comfort, Cade and Orin dismantling their rifles with the reverence of priests, Rusk muttering updates to a calm that didn't love us anymore, and Elira sat not at the edge but closer than before, tail curled in tight circles, eyes flicking to mine and away with a stiffness that wasn't fear so much as uncertainty trying on a new coat, and Jax nudged my boot with his and whispered that if she came any nearer people would mistake us for a story, and I told him to shut it with more heat than humor, because the truth is a mirror you don't want to hold when your hands still remember silk. She answered me only once that night, when a shallow scrape on her forearm drew my medic's kit and my clumsy apology, turning her gaze down to watch my hands with a stillness that felt like standing on black ice. And when I sealed the wound, she said thanks, soft as thread, and the squad became a forest of averted eyes because Elira had never thanked anyone for anything since the campaign began. And later, when the fire fell to coals, I found her on the watch line and sat with the distance of 2 palms between us, the stars snagged on the torn lip of the ruined roof, and the wind carried the world's old smell, and neither of us said what the day had drawn in blood and breath, though I could feel the question hanging like a low branch every time her tail twitched against the stone. When sleep finally dragged me under, it did so clumsily, dreams full of red arcs over void and the sensation of warmth caught in my gloves. And the morning was the brittle kind that makes voices clip and boots slip. And we filed out with our shadows long in front of us like warnings, and Alira took the place just ahead of me again. Distance measured in inches and meanings I didn't know how to forgive. And if her tail brushed near my thigh on the narrower turns, she stiffened in a way I pretended not to notice, because noticing is a kind of consent, and my pulse was too loud in my ears to pretend I was only a soldier counting ledges. And by midday, when we looked down on a valley that held its breath the way we were holding ours, even Jax had run out of commentary and left me alone with the arithmetic I couldn't solve. We drank in shifts and pretended not to watch. And when the march resumed, her proximity sharpened into a pattern, not quite leading, not quite shadowing, closer than regulation and farther than comfort. A choreography that wrote itself between us in steps my boots learned without permission, and Cade tugged me aside under the shade of a fractured buttress to say the obvious with the tone of a man who hates prophecy, that I'd set a pendulum swinging and had better decide whether to catch it or be hit by it, because Alira's composure had always been a pillar we leaned on, and the crack I'd made might be benign or it might invite weather, and I told him I knew, which was the closest thing to a lie I'd spoken all week. By the time dusk laid rust and violet across the cliffs, we had earned another cave that didn't hate us, and the fire turned ration trench into something like food, and Rusk mapped our night like a miser counting coins he was sure to lose, while Alira cleaned her blade in the same deliberate circles as always, yet chose a stone across from me instead of the darkness beyond the glow. Tail coiled in restless loops, as if it were trying to learn a new alphabet, and Jax kept kicking my boot in a rhythm that meant say something. But I swallowed the apology that had been burning my tongue because I didn't know which word would be a fuse and which would be water, and the quiet stretched until it almost sang. I finally crossed to her, because sentences have to finish, and because pretending has a shelf life. And I told her I was sorry for the touch, even if the touch had saved her life. That instinct is poor at reading law, that I hadn't intended to write a contract in silk. And she tilted her head with one ear flicking as if listening to something on a frequency I could not catch. The corner of her mouth bending into an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite a baring of teeth, and she said apologizing for rescue was a human hobby she didn't plan to learn, and I tripped over clarifications that were only synonyms for fear until she stood and brushed past me to retake her post at the cave mouth. But in passing she leaned close enough that her breath ghosted my ear and said the problem wasn't that I had touched her tail, the problem was that she had liked it. Her tail slid across my forearm then, a deliberate curl that held for one heartbeat longer than accident, warm and silken and wholly alive. And by the time my brain made it back to my body, she was already a silhouette against the twilight, posture composed, ears still betraying the smallest tremor, and when I turned back to the fire the expressions waiting for me were a chorus of open mouths and swallowed oaths. Jax trying to whisper and failing, Cade deciding the best way to avoid saying something stupid was to say nothing at all, and Orin muttering that we were dead men walking because Fox Law had a way of collecting even from those who loved to be broke, and I told them to keep their voices down, which was like telling night to be darker. We moved before dawn, cold sawing through our armor as mist braided itself around the stone, and I tried to focus on gradients and ranges and the geometry of kill zones. But her sentence kept replaying in the small theater behind my eyes, the echo of liked it bending every other thought into its orbit, and she marched near me again with that same terrifying calm. Only this time she didn't pull away when the path narrowed. Only this time the faint brush of her tail against my armor felt less like accident and more like grammar, and Jax on my far side wore a look that asked questions I wasn't prepared to answer. So I let the morning carry me forward like a river carries an argument, toward a ridge line and a pause and a future that had not been cleared by any superior officer I recognized. Dawn sifted pale through the ribs of the ridge and laid a thin shine on the world, the kind of light that convinces you wounds are only shadows if you stare long enough. And we moved in a hush that pretended to be stealth, while our joints clicked like old locks, Sergeant Rusk cutting angles with 2 fingers and a chin tilt as the path narrowed to a balcony carved by spite. And Alira kept that half step ahead of me that felt less like leadership and more like orbit, her tail's fringe brushing. air near my thigh and a pulse that made distance into a decision. While Jax watched us both with a gambler's dread, and Cade muttered prayers to a gun he could field strip blindfolded, because sometimes machines forgive in ways people never will. The valley spilled open on our left like a green secret somebody had scalded. Terraced fields gone to brittle. Irrigation veins cut and clotted. The distant roofs of a raised hamlet listing like broken teeth. And Rusk sent Orin and me out as skirmishers while the rest hugged the wall, eyes up for sentries that might be patient. And at a shattered overlook, we found a shrine cracked from basalt. 7 smooth stones stacked like a spine with braids of pale cloth woven through, vulpine script etched. Shallow by a careful claw, and Alira drifted to it as if pulled on wire. Ears lowered and breath caught in a way that made the air heavier for all of us. Then she brushed a single fingertip across the lowest rune and bowed not in piety, but memory, which is a sharper blade than reverence when you use it right. A low hum drifted from the east, not machine and not wind, a resonance that made my molars complain, and Alira flinched before any of us heard it true, tail bristling in an arc that telegraphed danger the way flags telegraph sovereignty. And then the sound resolved into a swarm, beetle-sized recon skates yawing between the stone ribs with camera eyes like cold fruit, their shadows flickering over our faces as they tasted our heat and tagged our signatures for someone expensive to read later. So Cade snapped a tight spray to peel a handful apart, and Orin threw a noise bomb that convinced the rest they'd already feasted, while Rusk hissed recovery and vector, and we slid back under the ridge lip where the rocks smelled like the inside of a dry mouth. We threaded a broken goat track toward a rusted funicular station where the cable hung slack like a dead vein between mountain clavicles, Rusk counting seconds and compass ticks. And just before we reached the girders, voices bled down the hillside from a checkpoint we hadn't seen on the sat maps. Insected troopers laughing in their glass-chime cadence about rations and lottery assignments to the warm zones. And Alira's ears canted a fraction as she translated in a whisper that sanded itself into my spine, while her tail curled and uncurled with the impatience of a blade wanting to be unsheathed. But Rusk tapped a hold and made us watch patterns, because patience is just speed with better handwriting if you want to live long enough to tell a version later. We ghosted past only because the wind chose our side and the troopers were arguing over a forbidden radio channel broadcasting human songs from another century, voices filtered thin by stolen frequency. And there was a slow ache in my chest hearing it. The war sitting down beside me like it had all the time in the world, and then a child's cry cracked the air from below the station. A quick startle keen, and then silence. And Alira's head snapped toward the sound with the terrible focus of a hunter who recognizes prey only to remember she was once small and soft and not yet a uniform. And I saw the choice write itself across her shoulders. Mission on one side and mercy on the other. And before Rusk could weigh the ledger, she was already moving on a line I didn't know how to break. The ruin below held what had once been a wayhouse turned field cell, its doorway ripped and repatched with sheet metal nailed by angry hands, and inside a small figure hid behind a stove carcass, eyes wide and bright as hard candy in a sandstorm. Insected soldiers circling with the bored cruelty of men who don't call themselves men, one jabbing the stove to make the child flinch like entertainment. And Alira slid through the hole in the back wall, as if stone had remembered her shape. Then she was there among them. No warning, no speech, a red flicker and 3 heartbeats in quiet. Her knife finishing the last throat while the first body finished learning how to fall, and she turned to the child with blade already sliding back home, voice lowering until it was only velvet, ears flattened not in fear but gentling. Tail curling to form a red parenthesis the child could step into without being frightened by the space. We didn't have a plan for that wait, for a child whose name came out as Sarah between chapped lips, for tiny palms raw from climbing concrete that didn't want to be climbed, and Rusk bit the inside of his cheek in a calculation that tasted like orders versus sleep. But Alira was already knotting a sling from her scarf and binding the child to her chest with a competence that came out of some memory I'd never be invited to. And when Rusk signaled argument, she stared at him until the conversation died. The kind of stare that says I am a soldier, but I was something else first, and that something else outranks you in this. And he looked away because good leaders know when they've been outranked by a different sort of necessity. We moved with Sarah's heat, a new star in the constellation of our formation. Elira's tail now a guardrail for two. Her steps altered by the added heartbeat, yet not once compromised. And Jax whispered to me that the line between breaking a law and keeping one is mostly drawn by who's watching, which would have been clever if it hadn't also been true. And while we angled along a scree slope, the swarm hum returned. Larger, meaner. A carrier's deep-throated promise rolling over the ridge, and Rusk's hand chopped us flat as a gunship shouldered out of the sky like a bad idea growing wings, its belly gun already spooling up, and I counted the cover worth naming and came up short by several miracles. The gunship raked our slope and turned stone into knives, carving trenches through shale that tried to bury our knees. And Cade and Orin set their heavies in a singing while I threw a burn foam canister into the air, where it blossomed into a white cloud that smeared our signatures and bought us 3 breaths. Elira tucking Sarah tight and angling toward a culvert that looked like a throat someone had tried to close with rubble. And I followed because following her had become a tendon and not a choice. And when the foam thinned, the gunship dipped for another pass, hungry to draw lines through us. But Orin's shot kissed the intake, and the engine coughed a ragged metal cough, the birds slewing and clawing for altitude while leaving a cough of black that smelled like victory wrapped in cancer. Inside the culvert, the air tasted like damp coins and old apologies, water whispering over stone with a sound that remembered forests, and Elira crouched with Saren nested against her, the child's breath of quick birds and sap, and I knelt opposite with my medkit open the way priests open books, checking for shock and burns and the kinds of wounds that hide under adrenaline. And Elira's gaze rested on me with the weight of the word from last night. Liked. Heavy, not like a burden, but like a promise you don't get to make alone. And when my knuckles brushed her wrist to test Sarah's pulse, her tail touched my ankle in the deliberate way of grammar rather than accident, a punctuation that did not ask permission because it had already offered it. The culvert led us into a drainage belly under the funicular station, where bones of machinery lay rusting like the vertebrae of dead gods, and Rusk parceled watches, while Cade strung a tripwire of bottle caps and vibrafilament that would sing danger in a language we could all dance to. And in the pause, Elira and I sat a little apart from the circle, the child asleep at last, her small fist curled in the coarse fabric over Elira's breast like the hand of someone who intends to keep, and the lantern along the wall painted Elira's profile into a relief I could have pressed my palm against. And she whispered without looking at me that the shrine runes had been for a regiment of her people cut down in the first sweep here, names etched by surviving lovers because the commanders would not permit a monument. And I understood then why she had bowed, why silence sometimes wears teeth. I told her what Jax had said about laws and witnesses, and she smiled with the corner of her mouth, a fox's humor that forgives you for trying to be clever by letting you know you aren't. And then without flourish she unwrapped a narrow strip of black cloth from her sleeve seam and tied it around my wrist, pulling the knot until the cloth bit, a sharp little kiss of thread on skin. And I looked down at it like a man reading a verdict in a language he can sound out but not translate, and she said, very quietly, that among her people a tail touch without sanction is chaos, but a tail touch given to rescue may be sanctified by reciprocation, and that the cloth meant I would not be unclaimed if I wished otherwise. And my mouth found yes before my caution could stand up, because sometimes the body arrives at truth while the mind is still unpacking its excuses. Russ pretended not to see the cloth because leaders are always notarizing or erasing realities, and he had enough of the former on his ledger. But Jack saw and gave me a nod that looked like respect borrowing a coat from fear, and Kate only said that bonds make better cover than rocks if both parties intend to live, which sounded like an old proverb because maybe it was. And Orin passed me a fresh battery and clapped my shoulder hard enough to remind the knot who owned the arm, and we slept in shifts while the drainage wind threaded cold fingers under our collars, the gunship's distant coughing fading to a rumor that let the stones settle back into the shapes they preferred. At mid-afternoon, gray-sour light leaked through a grid above, and Rusk said we'd make for a maintenance ladder and take the upper truss to cross the ravine, a plan that offended my fear of falling but made tactical sense. And Elira relocated Sarah to a backsling where the child could sleep and the warrior could fight, then offered me her palm to brace as we climbed, because ritual is a structure and structures share their strength. And on the grating above we found the sky, all torn gauze and the ravine flexing its long muscle of air, the far truss fretted with icicles of slag, and halfway out the bridge groaned a warning that arrived in my knees before it reached my ears, because old steel likes to announce its resentments. The enemy announced theirs with a crack of blue from the far lip, a sharpshooter buried in a nest of wire and stubborn sandbags, and the first round took a notch out of the girder near Oren's ankle. The second cut clean through the pack frame on Jax's shoulder and left his luck smoking, and we dropped to bellies as the world narrowed to slits and crosshairs. Cade cursing with art while he tried to angle a shot through latticed metal without murdering physics, and Alira slid along the grating. Like a liquid decision, tail flattened low, eyes calculating ricochet and wind and the inches between a guess and a eulogy. Then she looked back at me, and I didn't need a dictionary to understand the order. On your count, so we rise together and steal the angle the shooter thinks doesn't exist. We moved on too, because expecting 3 is a human habit, and we wanted to behave like weather instead, popping to knees at a staggered spacing that made his math ugly, and I stitched beams at the sandbag lip to pull his muzzle a hair left, while Alira cut right and up, a diagonal brave enough to make my stomach reach for prayer. Then her rifle spoke once, twice, patient as a schoolteacher, and a small black shape flipped backward with a sound human throats don't make, and the gorge gave the echo back like a blessing in a language of stone, and only then did I notice the chipped edge of the girder had taken a bite from my forearm deep enough to argue with the cloth's black kiss, blood slicking my glove and wrist in a warmth that had the indecency to feel good. I said I was fine because men are taught to lie to pain as if pain were gullible, and Alira said nothing but caught my wrist in a grip that made argument decorative, her mouth tightening at the sight of my blood threading under the bond cloth, and she tore a seal strip with her teeth and wrapped me with an economy that practiced itself long before this war hired her talent. Then she bent and pressed her muzzle to the knot. A vulpine benediction I'd seen once in a market between a mother and a child and never since, and the heat of that brief touch ran along the cords of my arm like a line of code compiling clean, not magic and not placebo, just the way recognition resets the body to an older promise. By dusk we had the ravine behind, and the funicular station's far platform underfoot, Sarah waking to ask for a mother whose name Alira wrote on the air with her eyes, because voice would give it too much power, and Rusk said we'd hole up in a warehouse where cable spools slept on their sides like fat moons, and there we chewed rations and let our nerves wring themselves out while Jax told a story that wanted to be funny and almost was, and in the middle of his punch line the floor thrummed with an approaching rhythm we already knew would be boots, not skates or drones. A squad on foot sweeping the platforms with the confidence of men whose map has our deaths circled in neat red. We took positions in the rafters and behind spools and under conveyors that had all forgotten their names, Rusk drawing a kill box with gestures we could have read with our eyes closed by now. And the insected unit entered in 2 files with their leader's crest-picked helm glinting like a beetle's back, voices clipped and precise as if they admired their own discipline. And it would have gone like so many other ambushes we'd won by inches if not for Sarah's cough. A small, apologetic sound that might as well have been a flare in a midnight field, the nearest trooper's head snapping toward our shadow, and his muzzle following like a dog on a leash. Alira moved before the thought of moving visited the rest of us, snatching Sarah into her shield arm, and stepping into the open not as a sacrifice, but as a problem the enemy would focus on, and focus they did, muzzles pivoting, lines of fire crossing into a net that would butcher anyone standing where she stood, and my body remembered the cliff without waiting for my mind. Legs launching me off the iron catwalk into a swing that burned my palms and dropped me like an argument beside Alira, my shoulder taking a bolt that felt like a fist full of knives, my own rifle roaring back, because reciprocity is a moral as old as breath. And then Cade's heavy sang and Rusk's line opened, and Oren stitched the doorway into a denial. The fight shortened and thickened and then stopped, the warehouse reeking of coolant and char, and the unbelief of men who thought training could ransom them from luck. And I sagged to a knee with my shoulder screaming in languages I hadn't learned yet, and Alira set Sarah down behind a spool and turned on me with the ferocity usually reserved for enemies, hands all over my armor seals, breath and audible anger that I had intercepted lines meant for her, as if taking a strike could be called theft when the war never runs out of them. And when she found the wound's entry and exit and the ugly cook of tissue between them, she made a sound too soft to be a curse and bound me fast, tail coiling around my waist, as if to hold me to the earth until the ground remembered what it owed me. Rusk said we couldn't linger, and he was right. The first gunship's cousins probably already curious where their brother had gone to complain. So we gathered our scattered breath and our scattered brass and slipped out the bay into an evening that wore the color of bruises, taking a maintenance stare that spiraled down the cliff face like a polite threat. Sarah quiet again, with that hammered stillness children learn too early in wars that teach too much. And halfway down, Alira slowed and looked back at me, not checking the wound this time, but hunting my eyes for an answer to a question she had not yet asked. And when she found whatever made her ears soften, she faced forward and continued with a posture that made a promise to the path. We bottomed out into a pine belt that smelled like a better century, needles damp and soil forgiving. The sky trapped in branches that sketched maps to places nobody now had the leisure to visit. And we made camp without fire in a hollow where roots braided into a cradle, Sarah asleep between Alira and my coat rolled under her head, while Rusk drew a perimeter and Cade set his quiet alarms, and Orin finally let himself breathe like a man who might do it again tomorrow. And Jack sat beside me and asked if the cloth itched, because if it did, that meant it was working, then failed to smother a grin and told me he was glad in the way soldiers are glad for each other when gladness must be smuggled in under seriousness. The night held its breath long enough for the stars to remember their names, and on second watch Alira came to where I sat with my back against a root, and the ache in my shoulder tutored into something like endurance, her silhouette a red-trimmed punctuation against a sky that had decided to be generous for once. And she settled beside me with her tail crossing my ankles and said into the darkness that bonds among her people are not only about claiming but about shelter, that the tail is not only sacred because it belongs to the self, but because it is the self's promise to shelter another. And I swallowed that like water after salt because it made the law less a wall and more a house. And houses are easier to want than walls. I told her we would make space for the promise even if the war tried to bill us extra, that I would carry what the cloth asked for as far as my legs could remember forward, and she nodded just once and leaned until her shoulder touched mine and stayed there, not coy and not ceremonial, simply a recalibration of how two bodies occupy a small piece of earth without asking it for permission, and the night stretched with that new geometry, the quiet no longer pressure but architecture, and somewhere nearby an animal made the small question sound animals make when they are alone and do not want to be, and Sarah murmured in her sleep as if answering. And for a span of minutes the world did not try to collect its usual taxes. We broke camp at a gray that came too quickly, feet finding the trail with the stubborn intimacy of people who have shared danger long enough to walk each other's gates, and the pines thinned to reveal a switchback road that would snake us toward the radio relay we'd been sent to break, its dish a pale coin against the next ridge, and Rusk raised his hand to halt, because down on the first curve a convoy idled. 3 trucks with canvas backs and a command crawler fat with antennae. 20. Troopers wearing the bored expression of men who believe the map's neat red circle is still accurate. And Alira's tail lowered into the curve that means plan among her people, and Rusk's eyes cut to mine and then to her in a question that acknowledged the new grammar in our unit without asking permission from the old one. We crawled the plan out of the dirt with pebbles and a stick, Alira's claw sketching arcs and timings with a confidence I'd seen before and wanted to deserve. The idea is simple, because simple survives bullets. Cade and Orin taking the high rocks to turn the road into a cage. Jax and I slipping low to steal the crawler's throat. Rusk holding the hinge where retreat would be attempted. Alira the spear who would break the first truck's discipline so hard the rest would forget their doctrine long enough to die of confusion. And when the count came, I felt her tail brush my calf not as an accident or a benediction, but as the click of a safety released on a promise we had both agreed to fire only when the target was away home. We moved on one because sometimes you have to be earlier than fear expects, sliding through scrub and shadow, the trucks burbling diesel breath while the troopers smoked the wrong end of their boredom, and the first part went so clean the road itself might have been complicit, Cade's thunder cutting the lead truck's axle like a tendon, Orin's pattern teaching the rear guard to stop believing in cover, Rusk's hinge snapping shut with a snarl. And then Jax and I were at the crawler's side with Charges gloved and timing set. My shoulder a live animal snarling against each reach. And as the last charge kissed steel, I heard a sound that made my bones try to forget how to stand. A gasping whine from within the canvas of the middle truck. Not wounded men and not machinery. The unmistakable chorus of caged children who had learned the wrong octave for fear. Alira heard it too. Of course she did. Every line in her body tightening into the gallows choice she keeps having to make. And she went not toward the fight's center but toward that canvas, cutting the lashings with a flick that would have won prizes in better festivals. And inside we found 6 small faces and 2 small bodies too quiet, wrists bound with cheap ties, eyes gone glassy with the learned helplessness of cargo. And she lifted 2 at once and thrust them into my arms and said go. With a voice that made it an order you obey first and argue with later. And the battle compressed and lengthened around us like an accordion in a drunk's hands while I shepherded a line of lives into the ditch that wanted to be a trench. And Rusk swore at history and nevertheless pivoted the plan to make rescue the new objective because the good ones always do. We were almost clear when the crawler realized its map had been redrawn without consultation and tried to berth a turret from its roof. And Jax went for the ladder with a bravery that looked a lot like Impulse wearing Courage's coat. And the turret found him halfway with a spray that stitched bright holes in the air around his grin. And I lunged because I am tired of being too late, and my shoulder made a sound that bodies aren't built to make. And Alira arrived the same second from another vector, and between the two of us we pulled him behind the crawler's flank while Cade took the turret's argument personally and converted it into scrap. And Jax wheezed thanks like a man telling a joke to his own luck. And Alira's tail coiled my waist again with a pressure that said stay in the world even if the world is trying to be stingy with its permissions. When the noise settled, it did so reluctantly, as if the day wanted to keep talking, and we were left with smoke and rescued voices and a handful of prisoners who thought they understood defeat because they had never met this particular version of it. And Rusk set a controlled burn on the crawler's comms. Cade and Orin policed brass. Jax found a smile he hadn't used in days for the smallest among the saved. And Alira stood with Sarah at her hip, and the new children clustered like small moons around a planet that had offered them gravity. And she turned to me, and I saw the next ridge in her expression. The knowledge that rescue makes missions grow teeth, but also makes reasons to survive grow spines. And I nodded because the bond cloth on my wrist had stopped feeling like ownership and started feeling like a compass. We pushed the convoy's wrecks off the curve and buried our trail with the brisk, practiced ruthlessness of people who intend not to be found. And then the road bent into pines again, and the wind brought us a smell that wasn't ours, clean ozone and old copper, the breath of a relay dish washing its sins before dawn. And Rusk said we'd rest once more before the approach. In a saddle where the ground lay low and remembered being meadow before the bombs wrote a different biography. And as the squad settled, and the rescued clung to sleep like a cliff face, Alira came to sit beside me with her tail resting across my boot like a curtain half drawn, and she said in a voice that had learned to be quiet without being small that after the dish we would need to decide if we were a unit with a mission or a family with an obligation. And I told her we were both, and that both is a harder road, but I had chosen it when I grabbed Silk over the void, whether I admitted it out loud or not. The night held that answer like a coin between finger and thumb, flipping it in starlight as if to check both faces for fraud. And somewhere a night bird practiced a note too sweet for this place and time, and the children's breathing made a new rhythm under our old one, a backbeat that complicated the song into something worth hearing. And Alira leaned until her head touched my shoulder just once, and then lifted again as if to promise and not to presume. And the bond cloth bit a fraction tighter in the cold, which felt less like constriction and more like reminder. And I thought of the shrine and the names in shallow claw script, and the way memory is a weapon when you choose to aim it. And the ridge waited for us, and the dish gleamed pale like a tooth in a giant smile that had not yet decided what to eat next. Dawn found the relay ridge scraped clean by old winds and newer fires. The dish a pale coin tilted against the sky trying to forget last night. And Sergeant Rusk laid the approach out on a page of dust with a stick while needles sighed above us, his voice low as a cough as he split us into knives and shadows and anchors. Cade and Orin to the northern spurs with their thunder boxed and leashed, Jax and I to the ductwork that scarred the slope like veins. Alira the spear that would slip first, through whatever seemed pride had left in the enemy's armor. The rescued children cocooned with Sarah under a root tangle and 2 tripwires that would sing like bottles if touched, because mission and family now shared a blanket and we would have to learn to sleep without kicking each other awake. The relay's perimeter fence had been patched by men who believed in diagrams more than weather, razor wire frizzed with frost, and signs that carried the bureaucrat's courage, the kind that shouts in black letters while the hillside listens without comment. And we moved under the lip of a utility trench where the mud remembered rain that hadn't visited in a month. The trench stuttering in and out of cover while uplink pylons marched like a priest's idea of order, and at a culvert mouth Alira paused to study the cross-traffic of sentry paths through steam rising from the generator housings, her ears making small calculations while her tail brushed my calf once, a deliberate tick that meant ready rather than reassurance, and was somehow both, the bond cloth on my wrist answering with a pulse that might have been my own. We went low and left when doctrine expected right and high. Jack's ghosting behind us with a coil of fiber and that grin he wears when luck is pretending to be skill, and I eased a hatch with a pry I'd bribed from a maintenance kit 2 wars ago, the rubber seal sighing like a secret that wanted to be kept, the duct beyond swallowed by dark and oil smell, Alira slipping first, as if her bones had been measured for the space, shoulders compressing with a grace that belonged on a stage and not in a war, and I followed hand over hand on a ladder slick with condensation, while the dish's slow servo groan traveled through the metal into my teeth, a mechanical whale song that made patience easier to counterfeit. Inside the service Warren the world traded vistas for angles, corridors with flaking paint and welded patches, rooms labeled in a language of numbers and hazard glyphs that all translated as somebody else's problem until the day it explodes. And we moved like punctuation along margins nobody reads until they must, Jack's dropping taps into 2 backbones and whispering to his wrist screen like a man coaxing a sulking dog. Alira working a vent grate with a twist of claw where a human tech would have cursed for 3 minutes and skinned both knuckles, me counting footsteps and breaths between the security cameras' small mechanical blinks, the trio of us becoming an argument the building could not quite hear yet, but would soon be forced to answer. The control ring sat above the servo bay, glassed in and smug. 6 insected techs in pale harnesses moving between panels with the proprietary concentration of people who believe they are necessary, and 2 troopers whose boredom had the mean edge of men eager for permission to be cruel. And we waited while a sweep of cameras blinked like eyes finishing prayers. Then Alira flowed through the grate and became velocity. The first trooper asleep forever before his muzzle cleared comfort. The second turning with the slowness of a bad dream while my beam wrote a line through his crest. Jax's tap flooding the comm bus with the kind of silence that terrifies professionals. And the 6 techs looked at our rifles and saw that their degrees had not trained them in this subchapter. One trying to reach a red lever because movies had lied to him about red levers. Alira's tail clipping his wrist with the gentleness of a teacher removing a finger from an open flame. We had 90 seconds before the outer guard understood that their radios now spoke only in fog, and Rusk's voice crackled through a click code we'd built in the pine belt. 2 hisses and a tap meaning anchors in place. And Jack slotted the virus he'd named after a misremembered saint into the relay's throat, the feed jittering as the dish tried to decide if it still recognized its own heart. And I set charges on the servo ring with the dirty efficiency of a man who's broken more machines than he's fixed, counting down in my head to give fear a rhythm, while Alira watched the corridor with her blade out and a look on her face that belonged to a storm deciding where to stand. We chose interruption over annihilation because the dish carried every town's emergency channel with its war calls, and Rusk had a line he wouldn't cross even when victory flirted with him. So Jax's saint didn't kill the dish so much as make it tell the truth with a stutter, a relay that would utter half sentences and then cough, leaking location and cipher quiver into a public band a child with a crystal set could harvest. And when the first outer troopers arrived, they did it with the startled enthusiasm of men whose jobs just got harder, muzzles coming up into a kill box Alira had sketched with her tail's memory, and my explosives did the rest. Not glory so much as punctuation, not finale so much as a difficult comma. We broke the glass and drifted along the outside catwalk with smoke clawing the air and alarms we'd strangled trying to rediscover their voices. Cade's thunder waking the eastern spur into a drum the whole valley could learn, Orin feathering the western slope with patterns that convinced any reinforcements made of sense to choose another morning. And below us the dish shuddered like a large animal deciding between fight and flight, which was useful because indecision is a battlefield multiplier. And at the catwalk's elbow a squad of fresh troopers boiled from a hatch like pressure, the first three dying to geometry they didn't know they were arguing with, the fourth finding my shoulder with a shot that lit the old wound into new conversation, while Illyra's muzzle flared two calm replies, and her tail touched my hip in that quick grammar of "we are still here." We exfiltrated through an equipment cradle that had once hoisted replacements for motors nobody loved, rappelling into a wind that tasted of copper and Victory's cheap cologne, my shoulder a drumbeat I couldn't quite silence, and Jax humming a song older than the relay while his descender sang a higher harmony. And on the scree below, Rusk stood as if he were bored in a grocery line while Cade and Orin worked their last fusillade in slow discipline, covering the slope like people who understood both generosity and parsimony. And we folded into the rocks and then into the pines, our footprints erasing themselves with the cooperative intelligence of needles falling where we needed them, the dishes stutter spreading across the range like gossip that happened to be true. Back at the saddle the children woke in twos and threes, blinking at the daylight like small owls, Sarah reaching up without looking and finding Illyra's cloak lace as if she'd braided muscle memory overnight. And Rusk let us breathe for 3 minutes by the clock before he read the new map the relay had gifted us, a lattice of enemy movements and supply teeth that would grind through villages if we didn't put a stick in the gears. And he asked the question we'd hung on a root last night, and Illyra answered without ceremony, that we could be a unit and a family because those weren't enemies unless fear made them so, that we would move the children to the river hollow where resistance lines ate and slept, then swing north and cut the convoy whose route the dish had finally confessed. And he nodded because she had outranked him again with a credential nobody issues. We split into 2 braids of 1 rope, Cade and Orin ranging ahead with Jax to hang eyes along the north spur, Rusk and I riding center mass with the rescued carried between us like a vow, Illyra ghosting the flanks with Sarah perched on her hip and the tail arcing in lazy guard. And the land gave us a river the color of tea and the sound of patience, its banks cut with willow and the old tire tracks of happier contraband. And at the hollow a woman with shoulders like bread ovens and eyes that had cried on all the right days took the children from us with a tenderness that had learned to be swift, her people wrapping each small life in a name and a cup. And Sarah clung to Illyra long enough to make a promise without grammar before she let herself be carried into a tent that smelled of flour and soap and the secret currency of safety. We turned north lighter and heavier at once, which is how righteousness makes you pay, and the ridge threw knives of light in the late sun as if to suggest celebration would be premature, and Rusk's hand carved a hold in the air as we crested a lip to see the convoy we'd come to ruin. 3 carriers and a tanker coughing black, a half-dozen bikes running wing with the swagger of men who never learned probability as a love language, and the road narrowed to an S-curve over a gorge with a tired bridge that dreamed of honest work, and Illyra's ears lifted into the shape that means opportunity, her tail tracing a shallow sign as she measured the wind, and Cade whispered that if steel remembers and gods accept, the middle carrier would learn about gravity at an inconvenient moment. Jax went down to marry his charges to the bridge's bolts, a conversation about stress and timing that made his grin briefly religious. Orin set a snare of nails and wire at the exit of the first curve because wheels carry arrogance like a family trait, and Rusk sighted the rest of us among rocks that learned our smell in half a minute and decided not to betray us. And when the convoy entered the curve the road itself seemed to shrug, Jax's charges popping not to kill but to bend, the middle carrier yawing like a drunk at a choir rehearsal while Cade's first thunder removed its rear differential from the world's concerns, bikes scattering into poor choices and then into air, and Illyra was already running where common sense says don't, a scarlet arc toward the command cab, while my rifle taught the tanker a respect for leaks. The fight tried to be complicated, and we made it simple, because simple eats faster, the command crew dying to precision they never trained against, the tanker giving up like a beast that knew its job had always been to threaten and not to deliver, and the last bike peeled off for the gorgeous far track. A coward's cleverness that would bring back friends if allowed, and Alira launched for it with a sprint that made the world slow down to admire. Tail flared and muzzle steady as the rider's back grew larger in her scope. One shot that stitched daylight through a tire and unseated a man from his assumptions. And she was on him before he located his courage, knee in his throat and rifle at his core, but she did not fire because the bond cloth at my wrist burned like a reminder that mercy is a tactic too when you can afford it. We had a prisoner then, crest-helmed and angry in the way of men whose schools forgot to teach humility, and Rusk would have liked to walk away from the administrative work of interrogations, but he didn't. And under the bridge's tired shadow, we learned the convoy had been headed to a valley depot, where conscripts slept stacked like lumber and ammunition waited for a parade that would begin with our friends' funerals. And the route had a blind stretch where the road bored into a hill, a tunnel, with rust bloom on its lips and poor ventilation and a habit of eating radio signals. And Alira looked at me with that unblinking calculus and traced with her tail in the dirt a box that meant cage. A gesture our squads both understood as the difference between victory and a good story told by the wrong team. We set about caging the tunnel with the ruthlessness of people who intend to go home and tell it. Charges seated at mouth and throat, a spill of oil disguised as accident, 2 trip lines that could be stepped over by men who weren't frightened and therefore would not. Cade and Orin nesting on the ridge to write the overture with controlled thunder. Jax threading the last of his saints through comms to ensure the enemy couldn't cry for help to a god that was bored of them. And in the last minutes before we turned the key, Alira stepped close enough that the heat of her breath patterned the hairs on my wrist and lifted my hand to her tail, setting it against the silk carefully, not as a test and not as a dare, but as a declaration that turned the world down for a second while the mechanics of war waited politely. The touch was both return and beginning, wait and permission. The living warmth of her tail under my palm, a story the body tells itself when it needs to believe the future has room, and the bond cloth tightened a fraction as if to hum. And for that heartbeat, the tunnel and the charges and the ridge and the prisoner and the sergeant bent away from us like reeds in a strong breath. And then she withdrew with a softness that did not unmake the moment, and we returned to our stations without speaking, which is a kind of eloquence. And the convoy from the depot rolled into the far mouth with the cheerfulness of men who trust maps. And Rusk's fist closed and opened, and Cade's thunder struck, and the world lost its balance for a while. Stone and flame and air tried to exchange names all at once as the tunnel swallowed its own argument. The first 3 trucks accordioning into a lesson on hubris, the rear guards reversing into each other with the coordination of drunks herded by ghosts, and Orin's second volley chiseled the hillside into a sermon that persuaded the survivors to kneel, and we came down like punctuation again. Not gloating, because gloating is a hobby for winters, taking rifles and radio crystals and oxygen from throats that didn't value it. And the prisoner we'd made earlier washed with the attentive misery of a man learning a language too late to be useful. And when the noise thinned, Rusk counted us and found we owed no names to the ridge today, and let his mouth soften into a quarter smile, the most generous weather we'd had from him all week. We didn't linger because the ridge never forgets arithmetic, stripping the useful and burning the evidence until the air tasted like pennies and decisions, then ghosting north by Deer Path and Trickle Stream, the sun bruising itself against a bank of cloud that had opinions, and at a notch where the pines gathered to eavesdrop, we stopped, small and close, the unit and the family inside the same circle, the rescued already sleeping a day behind us under other hands, and Jax asked if any of us remembered the taste of bread that hadn't been smoked, and Cade said yes and lied beautifully, and Orin hummed the low line of a hymn without words, and Rusk looked at Alira, and then at me, and then at the dark, and said the war would punish us for being this lucky, and that we should prepare to apologize to tomorrow. We made camp without flame again, and the cold moved in like a relative who knows where the spare key lives. Alira settling beside me with the tail a warm, deliberate weight across my boots. Neither of us mistaking comfort for safety, but both admitting it wasn't the enemy. And in the deep hour a flare bit the horizon beyond the relay ridge, not ours and not routine. A straight pillar of white that said emergency in a dialect I wished I didn't speak, and Rusk was already on his feet while my shoulder rediscovered its democracy of pain, and Illyra's ears cut the night into angles that arranged themselves into a sentence, the sort that ends with now. And somewhere far below us the valley began to answer in little lights, villages and foxholes, and rumor waking up to a call that had not been rehearsed, and the bond cloth at my wrist warmed like a coal that hadn't finished deciding what it wanted to be. The white pillar of distress peeled the night like a knife through canvas, straight and deliberate against the horizon where the relay ridge had worn its halo all afternoon, and Rusk was already moving before the last sparks faded, gloved hand carving a route in the air that would take us along the shadowed ribs of the mountain instead of the road the enemy expected. His voice pared down to bone as he parceled tasks that tasted like risk. Cade and Orin to stitch a high corridor with Overwatch. And traps. Jax to wake the Saints still sleeping in his wrist coil. Illyra and me the point that would touch the signal first and decide if it was tragedy, trap, or both in the honest proportions wars prefer to serve, and the bond cloth at my wrist warmed, as if remembering that vows are most useful in the cold. We slid under branches that combed frost from the air and over boulders that remembered better centuries, the terrain steepening until breath felt like a formality. Illyra flowing ahead with Sarah's scarf knotted at her shoulder as a small relic, ears slicing the dark into intelligible wedges while her tail drew a quiet arc that was both reassurance and alarm. And below us the valley uncurled into beads of light that blinked questions at the sky with the patience of villages, some waking, some pretending to sleep, all of them listening for the next instruction as if the night itself had turned into a broadcast, and I measured the steps between us with the counting habit of a soldier who has learned that numbers are good handles when everything else is oil. The flare's root bloomed from the iron bones of an old pump station half swallowed by scree, doors ripped off in an earlier argument, windows black as unplugged eyes, the ground around it scored by recent tracks that argued with each other about who had arrived first and who had left uninvited, and Illyra held a palm to still me while she tasted the air and listened for the small lies buildings tell, then sent a scout lens under the threshold with a flick of thumb and forefinger, the lens, whispering back a digital sketch of a room too clean to be an accident, canisters with hazard glyphs parked in a stupidly neat row, a beacon rig squatting on a crate, as if it might sprout legs and walk when bored, and along the rear wall 3 figures huddled in the posture of people who have not decided whether rescue is safer than remaining cargo. Rusk's click code stole across our comms with a barber's certainty, 2 and a pause and 1. Anchor the exits, peel the lid, let the air tell us the rest, and Cade's first shot removed the station's side lock like a magician who thinks guns are cards. Orin's second taught the rear latch about humility. Jax's Saint crawled into the beacon and convinced it to stop lying about whom it served. And Illyra slipped through the front like a rumor, while I shadowed left toward the row of canisters that smelled wrong. A bitter copper sweet that said dispersal tox. Not potent enough to kill a battalion quickly, but hungry enough to make a village suffer in careful increments. And I felt the anger climb my ribs like an old friend I don't invite often because it drinks too much of me when it comes. The huddled figures were not children but medics, wrists zip-tied, faces gaunt in the way of people who ration sleep and hope in equal measures, and they blinked up at Illyra with a mix of awe and professional irritation, as if rescue were a thing you schedule around triage. And while she cut their bonds, she asked questions in a tone that said you can breathe later, the answers falling into a shape that made sense too quickly to be kind. Enemy sappers had seized them at dusk, armed the Tox 4. A wind shift at dawn, fired the beacon to bait us into triggering it or dying while trying to disarm it. And somewhere uphill a handler unit watched through a scope to confirm which particular flavor of mistake we preferred, which is the sort of scorekeeping that makes gods bored and soldiers inventive. Jax knelt by the beacon with the gentle contempt of a mechanic forced to repair a philosophical error, whispering to a nest of wires that never asked to be born, while Rusk and Cade argued with the canister's logic by sawing through fittings and spitting sealant where design had left ethics on the cutting room floor, and I dragged a crate into the doorway to build a windbreak against the gusts that now tasted like distant snow, bracing it with my bad shoulder and lying to pain with the practiced cruelty of men raised to think stoicism is better than common sense. And Illyra palmed a vent plate and read the pressure wave as if it had been written in her first language. tail angling toward the ceiling where a secondary dispersal unit had been perched to punish us for congratulating ourselves too early. We took the top guts out of the rig with a string of controlled ignitions that sounded like a flock of metal birds startled out of a dead tree, the tox hissing and then sulking into sealant while the beacon's heartbeat stuttered under Jax's offended humming. And when the rear hatch kicked under a boot we didn't own, Oren's rifle pronounced a denial, and then another, and then forgot the conversation entirely. And the station fell quiet in the way of places that have forfeited their purpose. The medics sagging into the relief that follows permission, Elira straightening with the tail's red fringe catching the weak spill of our lamps like a small flag rediscovering its duty, and Rusk tapping his wrist for the new map that comes after you decide not to die yet, and therefore earn another errand. We sent the medics valleyward with a code sewn into the ribbon of their route that would open friendly doors and close unfriendly ones. Jax spiked the beacon to broadcast a different refrain. Evacuate low ground. Burn contaminated cloth. Boil water twice. Do not touch abandoned crates with numbers that look like dates. And the flare smoke thinned to a chalky ribbon that unspooled toward dawn, while the ridge to our east rumbled with the patient tread of armor that had been promised a certain quiet night and now demanded a refund. And Elira stood beside me and said with her eyes that the bond was not romance only but logistics, not just forbidden touch bending into sci-fi romance, but the practical consent of two warriors deciding where to stand so the other could move. The enemy column announced itself by flattening a line of scrub with the lazy indifference of a landlord, 2 scout crawlers, and a troop carrier with its grin full of teeth, their lights demoted to slits, and their radios talking to no one in particular because Jax had already stolen their nouns, and Rusk spread us in the pump station's yard the way you lay a net in a stream, not to stop the river, but to coax it where it makes you richer. Cade and Oren in the rocks to our right with fields of fire that braided into something musical, Jax and me with the last of the shaped surprises and a coil of cable that would teach the carrier about humility, Elira the hinge because she is made of hinges, the tail a scarlet metronome setting the timing for violence we were trying to make merciful only to our side. The scouts nosed into our geometry and found out what it means to rely on doctrine when the world has changed its grammar, Cade taking the first spindle with a shot that replaced its engine with argument, Oren feathering the second into a drift that made our ditch look like appetite, and the carrier chose bravado because bravado is cheap in bulk, pushing into the yard and slewing its turret in a slow, hungry arc that rode us into its future, and on Rusk's open palm down we detonated the cable. Harness across its treads, a fizzing garrote of sparks that made the steel shrug and then think better, the turret stalling just long enough for Elira to run low and fast, cut through the exhaust baffling, and plant a love letter of thermite where the carrier kept its pride. The turret found me in the same breath because luck likes symmetry, rounds chewing the edge of the crate where my shoulder had been until a second ago and carving splinters into the night like angry toothpicks. And I rolled into the yard's long shadow with the lurching grace of a man whose body is negotiating a new treaty with physics, firing in bursts that taught the gunner about patience while Jack slipped under the carrier's belly like a prayer. And when the thermite flowered with that sullen orange, that means something important has decided to melt. The carrier changed its mind about the future, and the troopers inside discovered a new relationship with the exits, which we managed for them with the kind of stern kindness that leaves no room for appeals. Silence returned in ragged syllables, first in the turret's coughing, then in the way the rocks stopped answering back, finally in the cold licking at our sweat with an old dog's tongue, and Rusk counted us, and found us statistically improbable and therefore valuable for another day, sending Oren to check the scouts for maps worth stealing while Cade babysat the thermite's afterlife. Jax inventoried his saints with the possessive satisfaction of a tinkerer who has been proved right again, and Elira leaned her shoulder into mine with a pressure that was not decoration, tail crossing my boot in the unhurried claim that says we can afford 2 breaths unspent. And in those breaths I remembered that forbidden touch had become a compass and that alien romance, however the stories dress it, is mostly about where you stand when the line breaks. Dawn arrived as if it had been practicing elsewhere and finally remembered us, wet light peeling the frost from grass blades and making our breath briefly visible, an honest accounting of how many lungs we carried forward, And down in the valley the villages had begun to move with a choreography that made me believe in crowds again. Kettles up, smoke thin, doors hung open to let instructions in and fear out. Children trotting in pairs behind adults who hid their urgency under chores, and the relay, half-crippled, half-useful, stuttered our warnings and our simple theology of survival into tin roofs and prayer halls with the fidelity of an old radio learning a new station. And Rusk said we would walk the column downstream to the ford and give the crossing 30 minutes of our names before we turned toward the next argument. We escorted them over stones that had watched other wars mispronounce the river. Illyra at the far flank with her tail bent into the shape that means shelter, children stepping where she stepped, because small bodies learn geometry from the kindest available teacher, medics waving us through with the brisk gratitude of people who will thank you later when no one is bleeding. And Jax climbed a boulder midstream and played a ruin of a harmonica, because joy is illegal if you don't improvise the paperwork. The notes stumbling and then finding each other like refugees, and I laughed without permission at the way the sound made the river lift in places as if the water wanted to listen better, and that laugh lodged under the bond cloth and made it warmer, which I chose to understand as the vulpine equivalence of the heart nodding at a joke. On the far bank, where willow shadow gave way to clean meadow, a militia woman with barber's hands and a rifle that had been cared for with love stamped our cargo with approval and told Rusk the depot to the north had emptied like a pocket turned inside out, that our tunnel sermon had been heard and believed by the right congregation, and that enemy armor was sulking east toward the high road in a temper that could be useful if teased into carelessness. And Rusk looked at Illyra and then at me, and then at the map as if the paper might apologize for itself, and said we could afford a breakfast without fire, which was the kind of generosity he usually reserved for funerals. So we sat and ate quietly, letting the bread be bread and the water be clean without burdening either with metaphor. Illyra spoke then in a voice that was neither ceremony nor whisper, telling Rusk and by extension the meadow what vulpine bonds mean when the world is not listening, that the tale is a pledge to shelter and to be sheltered, that the cloth is a promise to carry and to be carried, that alien love stories make it sound like thunder when in truth it is mostly roofs and soup, rotations of watch, a hand on a wrist when panic rehearses. And Rusk nodded like a man who has seen enough kinds of marriage to recognize the durable ones, and he said it changed nothing and it changed everything, which is leadership's trick when it is practiced by someone you are willing to be tired for. And the squad made a few small noises that translated as we noticed, and we approve, and we refuse to be sentimental about it where anyone can see. We turned east with the sun grudging the clouds and the wind housebreaking itself in the pines, feet learning again the syllables of the trail, and as the ridge unfolded its long argument Illyra fell in beside me, and without prelude lifted my hand to her tail again, setting my palm against the silk with a steadiness that did not ask for permission because it had already been given and would be given again. And the contact was not feverish or hurried, not the dramatic flourish sci-fi romance. Posters promise, but the steady weight of a contract reread and initialed, a forbidden touch transformed into everyday grammar, of a vow that had survived ambushes and machinery and the insult of hunger and still found room to be gentle. We walked like that for a time that did not ask to be measured, the tail under my palm a warm metronome, counting something older than tactics, Illyra's shoulder aligned with mine, so our breaths could draft each other into efficiency. And when the trail kinked narrow, she released me and slid ahead with that red arc riding our path into air, the bond cloth flexing against my pulse with the quiet arrogance of a thing that intends to last. And Jax, behind us, said something outrageous about Fox, law weddings and ration cake, and Cade threatened to bake if we found flour, and Oren hummed that low hymn again like a man who had started to believe his own melody, and Rusk didn't tell us to shut up, because silence is useful until it starts to resemble surrender. By mid-morning the sky decided to be briefly honest, blue uncurling from behind gray like a note left on a table by someone who didn't have time to stay, and the path widened enough for three, and the war took a deep breath somewhere we couldn't see, and the valley answered with the small industrious sounds that mean life is doing its arithmetic again, and Illyra glanced back with an expression I had learned to translate. A look that asked nothing and announced everything, and I answered it by touching the knot on my wrist, and tipping 2 fingers toward her tail, a gesture that among her people is both salute and joke, and she flicked the white tip once, amused, and set her sights on the next bend. We did not speak of endings because endings are a superstition you indulge in when you think the math is finished, and ours wasn't, and we did not draft a treaty for what would come after the ridge let us pass, because treaties require tables and pins and enemy signatures, and we had none to spare, and we did not ask the sky to promise us anything but weather, because weather is the only promise that reliably keeps itself. And the 4 of us and Rusk, 5 if you count the river and I do, took another step and then another, the bond threading through our formation like a red seam that made the cloth stronger where it had been liable to tear, and somewhere behind us in safer hollows small lives practiced laughter again, and that, too, counted toward the total we were trying to keep ahead of.